This is our lesson entitled Northern Colonies, New England. So I'm going to start this lesson by providing you an overview of the two groups of people that we're going to focus on in this lesson: the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And I'm sure you've heard about them in some context in the past. Excuse me. So who were these people? They were English Protestant Christians living in England in the early part of the 1600s. They were loud and vocal critics of the Church of England. Now, what's the Church of England? By the early 1600s, the Church of England was the official national religion of England. So what does that mean? Well, a couple things that are important for us. First is that it was expected that everyone in the country be a member of the Church of England. There was no freedom of religion like we have here in the U.S. today. That really didn't exist. So it's expected that everyone sort of uniformly accept this faith, right? When you're born, you'll be baptized into the Church of England, and your parents will raise you in the traditions of the church and take you to church every week and raise you as a Protestant. The other feature that's important for our purposes is that the Church of England was and still is headed by the English king or queen. So before the early 1500s, England, like many other European countries, was a Roman Catholic nation, right? Where the king or queen of England, when they became king or queen, received their crown from the Pope or from some other high-ranking Catholic official. There were some serious disagreements in the mid-1500s in England between the king and the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. I'm not going to get into all of this. You may know the story already about King Henry VIII. Suffice it to say, by the early 1600s, you have still a Christian church in England, but instead of it being the Roman Catholic Church, it's now the Protestant Church of England, headed by the king. So the king takes control of the church, which is another way for the king to sort of exert control over the population. Before, the king was, head of the nation, but not really head of the church because the Pope headed the church. Now the king heads both the nation and the church. And operating under this belief that kings get their power from God. So the English population is, new generations of English people are being raised under this system where they're born, they're baptized into this church that's headed by the king. They live in a country that's headed by the same king, and there's no freedom of religion, which in many cases means there's really no freedom of thought or freedom of speech. So for people who are free thinkers and who may have different ideas about religion, especially, this is a difficult situation to be in. Now, another part of this to consider when we think about criticisms of the Church of England, the hierarchy of the Church of England. So I mentioned before the Pope, right? The Pope lives in Rome and governs the Catholic Church. The Pope was simply replaced by the king, right? So there's still this authority figure at the top of the church. All the smaller authority figures in the Catholic Church were sort of transferred over to the Church of England. So bishops, archbishops, and other types of high sort of clerical authorities, that system of hierarchy of people with different titles and different positions and different powers was simply transferred over to the Church of England. The churches themselves, right? Because as I said, the Church of England had been the Catholic Church until the middle of the 1500s. The churches themselves still resembled Catholic churches, right? With candles and statues and brightly painted windows, and even the services themselves. The weekly church services still basically followed the Roman Catholic tradition. And if you have any familiarity with the Catholic Church, you listening out there in internet land, or even the Church of England, which in the U.S. is called the Episcopal Church, you know that the Catholic Church and the Church of England, for that matter, there are no Bibles in Catholic churches, right? You can walk into a Catholic church and sit down. You're not going to find a Bible there. You won't find a Bible in the Church of England either, or in an Episcopal church. So why are these issues important? These issues are important because the Pilgrims and Puritans, they were these free-thinking people that I mentioned before. They were influenced by the Reformation, right? The Protestant Reformation of the 1500s that extended into the 1600s. They did not like the idea that the king, a political figure, was also a religious leader. They don't like that. They don't like the fact that the Protestant Church of England has this system of authority, these authority figures, bishops, archbishops, that were common in the Catholic Church, right? They don't like that. They especially don't like the fact that churches in England still look like Roman Catholic churches with the candles and the statues and the stained glass windows and the services conducted in Latin, the very elaborate vestments, the costumes that the priests wear. They're very uncomfortable with all of this. And why are they uncomfortable with all of it? Because according to the Pilgrims and Puritans, none of this is in the Bible, right? They use the Bible as their primary text and their primary source of information. And they look at the Church of England and they look at the Bible and they do a comparison. And they say, look, there's nothing in the Bible about a king also being head of a church. There's nothing about that. There's nothing about there being sort of a chain of command where you have like a pope or a king and then all of these sort of lower authority figures that I mentioned before. The Bible doesn't mention any of that. These are all creations of human beings. The Bible does not talk about architecture or interior design. And in fact, the Puritans and Pilgrims will say that the elaborate decorations inside Catholic churches, the stained glass windows, the statues, the candles, the finely carved wooden pews, excuse me, that all of this, not only is it not in the Bible, but it's a major distraction from what they believe uh, Christians should be doing when they go to church. And Pilgrims and Puritans, I mean, their views are very complex, but we can sort of boil them down to a very simple idea. Pilgrims and Puritans believe that Christians should study the Bible. They should study the text of the Bible. That if it's not in the Bible, then it's basically not important and doesn't matter. The Bible is the received word of God, according to Pilgrims and Puritans. It's unfiltered. It's a direct line between human beings and God, and that you don't need a king, you don't need a pope, you don't need bishops, you don't need archbishops, you don't even really need a priest. That as long as a person can read and write, that they should be able to read the Bible and understand its message for themselves, and that anything else beyond the Bible is a distraction and possibly even offensive to God, and could potentially lead to punishment down the road. So these are the basic ideas of the Pilgrims and Puritans. And again, if you were taking a class on colonial America, I would go into a lot more detail on their belief system, which, as I said, is very complex, but also quite interesting. You can read more about it in the text for the course, which I think does a good job of outlining their views. But for our purposes, I want to mention now that the Pilgrims and Puritans were not quiet about their opinions of the Church of England. Which again, if you're criticizing the Church of England, who are you also criticizing? You're also criticizing the king if you're criticizing the Church of England. And there's no freedom of religion in England in the 1600s, which also means there's no freedom of speech. Because if you criticize the church, you're directly criticizing the king, who was the leader of the church. So Pilgrims and Puritans were quite vocal, as I said at the beginning, about their views. They didn't hide their views of the church and its leadership and its architecture and its interior design and its traditions. Everyone knew how they felt, right? They weren't shy. And again, because they're basically violating these restrictions on religious views and political views. Many of them are arrested. If you remember our talk about the Quakers, right? Many Quakers also found themselves arrested for their religious views later on. And a good number of Pilgrims and Puritans found themselves expelled from the country, either directly or sort of through indirect pressure. And we'll talk about this in a minute. So who were these people? We'll start with the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are the smaller of the two groups. They didn't call themselves Pilgrims, first of all. They called themselves Separatists, and you see that on the slide there. When we use the word separatist, it's important to know what we're talking about. They were separating from the Church of England, meaning they had officially broken their relationship with that church, and they were trying to form something new. They were expelled from England in excuse me, in 1620, or actually before 1620. They arrived in North America in 1620. In the really mid to late 16 teens, they're expelled, again for their religious beliefs. They end up in the Netherlands first. If you remember, we talked about the Netherlands' reputation for toleration and for welcoming outsiders. They live in the Netherlands for a few years, and they're very poor. They have trouble finding work. They struggle to survive there before they finally decide to leave and go to North America, and they end up in a place that they call Plymouth. And Plymouth is basically southeastern Massachusetts. I'll show you a map in a minute. And Cape Cod, which is where they actually their ship arrived in 1620. Their long-term plan is to stay in Massachusetts, stay in Plymouth, and never return to England. They are going to form their own church. They're going to form their own society in Plymouth, and they're not going back. So this is a one-way trip. And everyone on board, the Mayflower, the ship that they take over, everyone on board knows it. It's a one-way trip. And again, why would they stay in England? I mean, they'd effectively been kicked out. They had trouble surviving in the Netherlands. They found a place that they thought they could live in. They're not welcome back at home, so they're going to stay in America. Now, the Puritans are different. Now, remember, their religious views are the same. The Separatists and the Puritans basically hold similar views about the Church of England. So, in that sense, they're the same, basically the same in terms of their theological outlook. The differences come in whether, so if I were to ask you about this, the differences come in whether they stay in the Church of England or leave, right? The Pilgrims have broken with the Church of England. The Puritans are going to stay in the Church of England, right? So they have not formally broken their relationship with the church. If you look at the word Puritan, it comes from the word purify, right? They are hoping to purify the Church of England of its Catholic influences. They're trying to get the church reformed more in line with their views. They are not rejecting it completely. They just would like to see it improved. So that's an important distinction between the Pilgrims and Puritans. One has rejected the church completely. The other would like to reform the church by staying with it. Another difference between the two really just has to do with where they settle in North America, right? The Pilgrims got to Massachusetts 10 years before the Puritans. The first Puritans don't arrive until 1630. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And because there were Pilgrims already in Massachusetts at that time, the Puritans have to settle further to the north in what they call Massachusetts Bay, which extends all the way up into Maine and eventually extends all the way out almost to the Hudson River. So, and I'll show you a map in a minute. The Puritans' long-term plan is to eventually return to England. And that's an important point to remember. They're coming over to North America. They're not welcome at home, just like the Pilgrims, but they're not quite ready to give up on the Church of England. They want to use their time in America to reform the church so that they can then go home and live in England, live in their homes, and be part of a church that matches their views. So the goal of the Puritans, and the Puritans are going to be the much larger group of the two, is to establish a new church in North America, to literally build new churches from scratch, decorate them in a way that matches their views, establish a ministry, right, again, that matches their views about hierarchy, and focus on the Bible, right, focus on the teachings of the Bible, focus on the text of the Bible, with the hope that over time, people back in England would receive news of what was going on in Massachusetts, that they would learn that there was a different way that the church could be organized, that there was maybe a different way that society could be organized, and that England would be inspired to change, that the church might change, that society itself might change. And so that's the overall long-term plan for the Puritans, right? Is to come to Massachusetts, build a new church with new traditions and new architecture, new interior design, new customs, uh, establish a new type of society, way of everyday living that would be an inspiration for England, so that England would change, so that all the Puritans could eventually go back home. So for the Pilgrims, the trip to North America is a one-way trip. They're not going back. The Puritans have hope that they'll be able to one day go back. As I mentioned before, this is our map of the area that we're looking at today. This is basically the final part of our lesson on the establishment of the colonies in North America. So you see Plymouth there, the green portion of the map, and Massachusetts, the purple section, and then, we've talked about Connecticut before when we talked about the Dutch. We'll talk about Connecticut a little bit more today. And Rhode Island, which we'll also talk about briefly. Rhode Island and Connecticut and New Haven, these are all colonies that are established, they're different, separate colonies established as a result of the arrival of the Pilgrims and Puritans. We're going to start by talking about the Pilgrims. I mentioned earlier that they were the first to arrive in what is now Massachusetts, so it makes sense to talk about them first. Even though the Pilgrims were the first to settle in Massachusetts, they were not the first English people to actually travel to that part of the world. There had been English fishermen who traveled to the coast of Massachusetts and what is now New Hampshire and Maine at the turn of the 17th century. They were mainly attracted to the cod fishery in that area that was really quite abundant, the cod population being very high in that part of the Atlantic. And these are commercial fishermen, so they're out there doing their business. And there are scant records showing that some of these fishermen, while they were doing their business along the coast of what is now Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, some of them traveled on land for brief periods of time. They didn't establish colonies or put up any buildings, but they made these sort of brief trips on land and then went back on their ships. We know that there was a smallpox outbreak in what is now Massachusetts from 1616 to 1618. We know that the indigenous people contracted smallpox. Remember, an old world disease that indigenous Americans were not immune to, a disease carried by Europeans. The mortality rate in eastern Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, that general area, was about 90%. So even though the Pilgrims are going to be the first Europeans to permanently settle in what is now Massachusetts, the diseases Europeans carried were already there before the Pilgrims arrived, and those diseases had already uh, devastated indigenous populations along the coast. Not uniformly, but certainly had a very harmful impact. So, as I mentioned before, the Pilgrims arrive in late November of 1620. 102 of these separatists aboard the Mayflower, right? Remember that ship that you probably heard of before, that they took from the Netherlands directly to the tip of Cape Cod. These are mainly middle class people, mainly families, so husbands, wives, and children, sometimes extended family. And these are people who have paid for their own transportation. Remember, this has been a theme we've been talking about almost every week. Who gets to come to America? Who doesn't? Who pays for them to get here? And in this case, these are middle class people with religious grievances, which we talked about before. And again, they've been expelled from their home country for their religious and political views. They've ended up in the Netherlands. They struggled there. And so they use what resources they have to travel to North America. So again, these are people who are not super rich, but they're not super poor either. They have just enough money to make this expensive trip. They, as I mentioned before, they arrive at what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is at the tip of Cape Cod, and then they sail across what is now called Cape Cod Bay to the site of a community that the indigenous people called Patuxet. And the Pilgrims get off their ship and they can see that there was a community here at one time. The people are gone, but the landscape indicates that there had been a community there in the past. It was obvious that there were old buildings and dwellings that were sort of falling apart, overgrown farmland that wasn't being taken care of. There were trails and paths, but there were no people. So anybody witnessing this scene would have known that there had been a community here in the past. The Pilgrims, of course, didn't know what happened to this community, why this community had fallen into disrepair. But a couple things happened. First, they decide they're going to stay there because clearly someone had already cleared away the forest, they had already built farmland, they had already sort of created trails and paths that could be used. So it's sort of convenient for the Pilgrims. They have a place where they can sort of move in and rebuild. They rename the settlement. This is something we've talked about before. They call it Plymouth, which is a community in southern England, so they apply an English name to the landscape. But they also interpret the landscape in religious terms. And this is something that we talked about, I think, in the first the first lesson in this class a few weeks ago. They look at this depopulated community that they encountered, and they interpret this as a sign of God's approval. They write about how God cleared away the local population just in time for their arrival, so that by the time the Pilgrims arrived, there was sort of a ready-made landscape that they could use and build on for their own purposes. The Pilgrims didn't know that smallpox had swept through the area right before they arrived and killed off large numbers of indigenous people. So not knowing why the people had disappeared, they thank God for having cleared them away, right? And this was very common throughout colonial America. Whenever European travelers arrived to a new location and found an abandoned village or an abandoned farm, they always, almost always, interpreted that as a sign that God approved of their being there. That God had removed the people who were living there before, so that the Europeans could move in and take over. Now, that might, as far as the pilgrims were concerned, that was nice, right? That as far as they knew, God had sort of prepared a welcome for them. But they arrived at the end of the year. They had a very difficult time that first winter in Massachusetts. They left too late. They left in September of 1620. They left the Netherlands and traveled across the Atlantic at a time of year that most European travelers to America did not travel, because they knew that if they arrived at the end of the year, they would have a very difficult time. But the pilgrims left late, they arrived late, and then they were stuck in the position of having to build homes during the winter. And they also arrived at a time after the harvest had happened. So finding food was difficult, finding a place to live was also difficult. And by the spring of 1621, there were only about 30 pilgrims left. Most of them died of disease and starvation during the winter. So I think it's about 2/3 of them died during that first winter. So when the spring came and the pilgrims were assessing their situation and trying to figure out what to do next, they realized that they would have to try to create a good relationship with the indigenous people nearby. The pilgrims realized that they would need to have a good relationship with them, because really the pilgrims needed the indigenous people more than the indigenous people needed them. Now, again, remember that Europeans always looked at indigenous people as inferior, as savage, as uncivilized, quote unquote. They never looked at them as equals, but at the same time, they realized they needed them. So they still sort of looked down on indigenous people, but at the same time, they realize that they won't survive unless they have a good relationship with them. So the local Algonquin nation was called the Wampanoag. They lived in that area of Cape Cod. And in 1621, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag create a treaty. They sort of create an alliance with each other. It's mostly based on trade. The indigenous people are going to help the pilgrims learn how to grow their own food. So the pilgrims have not come over to North America to conduct trade, right? These are not fur traders. They're not trying to find gold or silver to become rich. They've come over for religious purposes, but they also know they have to survive. So the relationship with indigenous people, this treaty, this alliance that they form, the indigenous people are going to provide what the pilgrims need. The pilgrims need food. The pilgrims need to know how to grow their own food. They need to know the best places to hunt and fish. And the indigenous people are going to provide all of that. In exchange, the pilgrims will provide consumer goods very similar to what we've talked about before. They'll provide cloth. They even have some cheap costume jewelry that's, kind of shiny, uh, knives, kitchen tools, farm tools, maybe some alcohol, maybe some guns and ammunition. I mean, the pilgrims, all European travelers carried this stuff with them when they came over because they knew that inevitably they would have to do some kind of trade. But the pilgrims and Puritans didn't really traffic in guns and ammunition and alcohol as much as some others did. But they certainly provided a fair amount of consumer goods to indigenous people in exchange for the food and knowledge of food that the Wampanoag gave to them. However, as I've mentioned before, indigenous peoples and Europeans, even when they were doing business with each other, even when they had an alliance, still had difficult relationships, right? Europeans almost always assumed that they would be in charge wherever they showed up. They had that idea of right of discovery, right? That if they were the first Europeans to arrive in a certain area, that they could lay claim to that territory. And that basically they were in charge from that point forward, and anyone who was living there already had to follow their rules. Um, Even if the indigenous people had been there for hundreds or thousands of years, it didn't matter. Europeans' sort of sense of superiority and sense of them being civilized sort of gave them this idea that if they arrived in an area first before other Europeans, that they could just take over. Um, that was especially true with indigenous people who they looked at as inferior. So the pilgrims have that same view that other Europeans had. Of course, the Wampanoag, they believe in sharing land, sharing resources, just like almost all indigenous peoples did. Uh, they welcome these outsiders. You see that picture there of the Wampanoag and the pilgrims, taking a walk uh, through the woods. Um, but at the same time, even though the Wampanoag were welcoming to the pilgrims and tried to help them and uh, allowed them to share the land and share the resources that they had, the Wampanoag assumed that they would be in control because they were there first, right? They laid claim to the land first. They had been there a long time. And they just assumed that as newcomers, the pilgrims would follow their rules and follow their way of living. So there is definitely a power struggle among these two, or between these two groups, from the beginning, because both sides want to be in charge, and neither side is really willing to accept the other's authority. And this is going to become a problem down the road. Both sides are concerned about becoming dependent on the other. The history of the fur trade by this point was well known. The fur trade, especially as it played out in what is now Canada and New York, where the two sides in the fur trade became locked in this really problematic relationship where both sides were dependent on the other, and if that relationship was ever broken, suffering and pain would come to both sides. So the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims really, they want to get along, but they don't want to depend on each other too much, because I think they understood the dangers involved in that, and so they tried to coexist with each other. They tried to sort of live in close proximity to each other with as much peace as possible. They tried to avoid conflict. They tried to get what they needed from each other. Um, and, as you probably can predict, this isn't going to last forever. Now we'll turn to talking about the Puritans, and we're going to spend a couple slides talking about them. They are the larger of these groups, and historically speaking, they're the more influential of the two groups, even though I think more Americans are probably familiar with the Pilgrims because they're strongly associated with the Thanksgiving holiday. The Puritans are actually, as I said, there are more of them, and their influence in American history and culture, I think, has been stronger than the Pilgrims. So we're going to spend a little more time talking about them. The first Puritans arrived from England in 1630 at what is now the city of Boston. So Boston was their first settlement um, in North America, just north of Plymouth. And again, they are, even though the Pilgrims and Puritans hold very similar religious views, uh, they're they are different groups, right? They have different long-term plans. They have different understandings of their place in the Church of England. And so they respect each other's boundaries. The Pilgrims arrived first. They established their colony in Cape Cod in Plymouth. The Puritans arrived 10 years later, and they respect the Pilgrims' boundaries and build their first settlement north of where the Pilgrims are located. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a sore throat today. I'm trying to speak as loud as I can. Over the course of the next 14 years, 20,000 Puritans leave England and arrive in what is called Massachusetts Bay. This is the name that the Puritans give to this area. And Massachusetts Bay, of course, is a body of water just off the coast of Boston. So the terminology, I guess, makes sense. Just like with the Pilgrims, these are mainly middle-class people, mainly arriving on ships with their entire families, so husbands, wives, children, sometimes extended family. And these are people who are paying for their own transportation costs. They aren't being excuse me. Uh, they aren't indentured servants. There isn't someone else paying for their trip. They aren't super rich. They aren't super poor. They're middle class, and so they can afford to pay for their own trip to the New World. Now, of course, just like the Pilgrims, they have been made to feel unwelcome in their home country because of their religious and political views. The Puritans, though, unlike the Pilgrims, the Puritans are not kicked out of England. They leave voluntarily. And again, you might ask yourself, well, why is that the case? Remember, the Pilgrims completely rejected the Church of England. So there was really no place for them in English society. The Puritans had not completely rejected the church. They chose to stay in the church, and they wanted to reform it from inside. And so they were not kicked out of the country, but they were certainly made uncomfortable by the English authorities. As I said, some were arrested, some were jailed and fined, and their lives were not happy in England. And so leaving the country was seen as an attractive alternative. Now, I want to talk about the family life of Puritans in Massachusetts. One of the defining features of Puritan family life in Massachusetts was that they had very large families. Sometimes they came to Massachusetts with large families already. In many cases, they arrived and their families got large once they were here. The average size of a family among the Puritans, and this could be found in other colonies as well. I mean, in general, people had large families in colonial America. Um, the average family size was roughly 10 children, um, surviving to adulthood, which meant many women were pregnant more than 10 times in their life. And there are some factors we have to think about when we think about why uh, families would be so large. Well, first of all, we have to look at the gender norms of the time. Men legally owned their wives, right? Women, wives, and daughters were the property, legal property of their husbands. So whenever the husband wanted to have relations with his wife, wanted to have another child, the wife could not refuse. So women had no independent legal identity in early modern Europe, which extended to North America. And so that explains part of it is the culture of patriarchy, um, where men basically ruled and controlled everything, from family life to politics to religion. The Puritans also had large families because they wanted to expand their ranks, right? They didn't want to just rely on Puritans who were fleeing England. They wanted a large community, and having children and raising those children in the traditions and customs of Puritan ideas and the Puritan church that's going to be built in America, was seen as a good way of legitimizing their ideas and showing that their ideas could work, right? If churches were full every week, if there were large numbers of people following their beliefs and their culture and their customs, they might achieve their goal, right? People in England might hear stories about Massachusetts, and they might hear about the churches being full, about the population of Puritans being very large, about people being happy and living their lives, um, and the church, the new Reformed church, being a success. And then the Puritans hoped if people in England heard about all of that, they might be inspired to copy what the Puritans were doing, and then they could all go back home. So the desire to increase the Puritan community through reproduction is part of this. The place where the Puritans traveled to northern New England, to the northeastern part of the Atlantic coast of North America, was generally more temperate in terms of climate, right? You see the Puritans walking to church there through the snow. They had 4 seasons. There was not the intense heat and humidity found down south in the Chesapeake. And people tended to be healthier and live longer in New England than they did in some other parts of colonial America. And so, because people lived longer, we've talked about this before, there was a tendency to have larger families when you knew that children would probably survive. So, the health of that environment, which helped improve the health of the people, also plays a role in the large number of children in each family. And of course, very, very simply, Puritans are going to need people to work for them. They're going to work on farms, they're going to hunt and fish, and children are a free source of labor. And so the more children you have, the more workers you'll have to help out with the family economy. So all these factors combined led the Puritans to have very large families, and they became known for that, actually. Puritans did not allow single people to live alone. And this is another sort of defining feature of family life in New England. They did not allow single people to live by themselves. People could be single, right? I mean, you could be divorced. Excuse me. Your husband or wife might have died. Um, you might have even come over from England as a single person and you were not yet married. You might be a young adult who was born here and you're not yet married. Whatever the reason was for a person not being married, if you were an adult and you were not married, you could not live alone. And this was a rule that was strictly enforced. And you might be asking yourself, well, why couldn't an adult live alone? Remember, these colonies we're talking about are not like the Chesapeake. They're not like, Pennsylvania or New Netherland. Um, this colony, Massachusetts Bay, and Plymouth for that matter, is not about people getting rich. It's not about people moving up in the social ladder. This colony is about the Puritan colony we're talking about right now is about reforming the Church of England, inspiring England to change its ways so that the Puritans can all go home, right? Once the church is purified, everyone will pack their things and go back. There is a danger if you let an adult live alone, right? That person might be doing things they're not supposed to do. They might be reading texts from the Church of England. They might be reading Catholic texts. They might be holding meetings inside their home with other people and sharing potentially dangerous political or religious ideas. They might be engaging in extramarital affairs and adultery. The possibilities were endless, but the important point to remember here is that these communities of Puritans and Pilgrims, the individual didn't matter, right? The individual was not important. The community was important. What the community was trying to do was most important. The community is trying to reform the church, trying to purify the church in line with its views so they can reform England and go home. If one person is not following those rules and not, on board with that plan, the possibility is there that the whole plan could fall apart because one person could be the weak link that could destroy the whole project, right? By spreading dangerous ideas or refusing to cooperate with the group. So single people had to live with other people. So the sheriff would be sent into each town every year to count the population. And if they found anyone living alone, they would have to go and live with a family. Hopefully they could find blood relatives for the person to live with. If they couldn't find any blood relatives, the sheriff would take the single person out of their home and basically force them into the home of the nearest neighbor. Because again, the idea was if you're living with other people, the other people are going to see what you're doing, what you're reading, what you're talking about, and the spread of potentially dangerous ideas could be contained that way. Remember, people's homes in the 17th century were often one large room. Kitchen, dining area, living area, sleeping area, all one room. So there was no expectation of privacy. in such an environment. And if you had dangerous ideas, if you were smart, and you didn't want to be punished, you'd keep those ideas to yourself. So single people not allowed to live alone. Everyone had to live in a family, even if you were not related to that family. The Puritans, and to a certain extent the Pilgrims, were obsessed with maintaining order and with keeping an eye on everyone in their community to make sure that everyone was following the rules. As I just pointed out, the home is where this surveillance started. Children were encouraged to listen to their parents' conversations, and if they heard anything unusual or potentially troublesome, to report their own parents to the local authorities. Parents even listened to their own children's conversations, and if they heard anything that was potentially problematic, they would talk to them and try to bring them back into the fold. So the home is really where this begins, where this sort of policing of people's thoughts and people's opinions and people's speech. Now, if you remember, what's interesting about this is that the Puritans and Pilgrims were either being kicked out of England or feeling like they had to leave England for the very same reasons, right? That they were not complying with the English government and the English church, right? They were speaking out against the government and the church, which was not legal, right? And they were punished for that. They come to America and basically establish the same system here, a very repressive, anti-democratic system. I'm going to show you a slide in a minute of a Massachusetts town, a Puritan village. The Puritans lived in towns, very compact settlements where people's homes were right next to each other, where when you went out during the day to work, and when you went out to go to church or to go visit, a friend or neighbor, you were constantly being seen by other people. So the town itself serves that surveillance function. Your homes are tightly packed next to each other. The farm fields where you go out and tend your crops, those are near each other too. And there's really no privacy in the town itself. So that's another layer of surveillance. And the final layer of surveillance is the church. Church attendance was mandatory every Sunday, 2 different services, one in the morning, one in the late afternoon. Ministers would take attendance. I mean, sort of like some of your professors do. And people who did not attend would be punished. And it would automatically be suspect, right? That, why isn't Jeff coming to church today? Is he a secret Catholic? Is he a secret, member of the Church of England? What's wrong with him? And there were public punishments for people who did not attend church. So, again, there's really no freedom of religion. There's really no political freedom in Massachusetts Bay, and in Plymouth too, for that matter, because again, the individual is not important in these communities. The community is the most important unit of social organization in Massachusetts Bay, with the goal of building this model society, purifying the church, and eventually returning to England to a reformed and hopefully improved society. Now, of course, if you study history at all, or even follow the news, you know that it's very difficult for governments and religions to control all of their citizens or all of their residents or all of their members, right? Governments can impose rules, churches, religious organizations can impose rules, but that doesn't mean they're always going to be followed. And the Puritans had a very hard time getting people to follow all of their rules, right? That people are individuals, right? It's hard to give that up. If you have your own independent way of thinking, or if you have questions or thoughts enter your mind, it's a struggle, right? Between what the community expects, between what the government or the church expects, and what you think is right, right? So, and I think we've all probably experienced something like this in our lives, right? Where you might be raised a certain way, and then you get older, and then you start to realize, well, maybe there are different ways of living, maybe there are better ways of living. Maybe the systems that I grew up under are not the best systems, right? Um, and it takes a certain amount of courage to reject your upbringing, reject the values and the customs and traditions that you were raised in. Um, it also takes a certain amount of courage, especially in a community like Massachusetts Bay, to reject the authority of the ministers, the Puritan ministers, and the colonial authorities who were trying to enforce total conformity of thought and opinion on the population. So people who spoke up and spoke out um, were taking a dangerous step. We'll look at four of these famous dissenters right now, just briefly, each one. In fact, you know what? I've got pictures for each of them. I will talk about them in order on the slides. So, again, the overall objective here is conformity. Conformity, conformity, conformity. They want to reform the church. They want to create a model society that England can be inspired by. They want to go back to England eventually. And they believe that the only way they can do that is by controlling people's minds and thoughts and opinions, and not allowing any dissent or disagreement. I mentioned before that uh, the Puritans built, and the Pilgrims too for that matter, built these tightly compact towns. So you can see the black dots with the sort of brown colored strips of land. You see where people's houses are. There's almost no space between the houses toward the center of the image there. The meeting house, that was the building that served as a church and as sort of like a town hall, like a city hall type structure, right in the middle of town. Uh, then you see sort of on the left side of the map the fields where farmers would go and tend their crops. So they had their homes all next to each other in town, and then uh, over on the left-hand side they had their fields where they'd have their animals or their crops that they would go and take care of. So when they were at home, there were constantly people around. When they were out at their fields, they would run into other people as well. And again, this is all designed with control and conformity in mind. Now, I told you I would talk briefly about four of the famous dissenters who lived among the Puritans, were Puritans themselves, and because they had, excuse me, different political views, got in trouble with the Puritan authorities. Thomas Hooker was actually a Puritan minister in Massachusetts Bay. He had publicly expressed his disagreement with the manner in which the Puritans conducted elections and the ways in which they appointed people to political office. And because he disagreed, so he has a disagreement about the political system of Massachusetts Bay, because he publicly expressed disagreement with the authorities, he is kicked out of the colony and he ends up in Connecticut. And we'll actually come back to this topic in a little while. This is an image of Roger Williams and his followers leaving Massachusetts Bay, being kicked out in 1636. So the same year that Thomas Hooker and his followers were kicked out and sent to Connecticut, Roger Williams, the same year, kicked out of Massachusetts and sent to Rhode Island. Roger Williams, what was his crime? He had spoken up and been critical of the ways in which the Puritans dealt with indigenous people, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The Puritans were particularly devious and in many ways very cruel to indigenous people, and Roger Williams spoke out against this treatment of indigenous people, and for publicly speaking out against the Puritan authorities concerning their treatment of indigenous people, he is, put on trial and he's banished to Rhode Island. And Rhode Island becomes sort of a dumping ground for the Puritans. This is really where many people who disagree with the Puritans are sent into exile. Because again, anybody who really publicly disagrees with them, there's no place for you in the colony. This is an image of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was a resident of Boston, a Puritan, born and raised in England. Obviously, she was one of the migrants to Massachusetts Bay. And what was her crime? Well, she started holding meetings in her house. I mean, this is something I mentioned to you a few minutes ago. She started holding meetings in her home with her husband present and, some friends of her family present, where they would talk about the Bible and they would actually talk about the Puritan church and talk about the ministers, and they would have meetings, and she would actually lead the meetings. Now, you might think to yourself, well, what's the big deal? I mean, a lot of people do this. If you have any religious views, if you attend religious services, you might occasionally talk about your religion in your own house. Well, that was not allowed. The problem wasn't really the content of what she said or these conversations. The problem was that she was a woman, and that she was, at least in the eyes of the Puritan authorities, she was taking responsibilities that were reserved for men by running a religious meeting, which made it look like she was a minister almost. And so she was put on trial a couple different times, and she was eventually banished from Massachusetts to Rhode Island. As I mentioned, that's where many of the dissenters ended up. She later ended up in the English colony in Long Island. So she crossed Long Island Sound and ended up in Long Island. And then later ended up in what is now the northern Bronx, where she was actually killed in the 1670s by indigenous people during a war. And if you guys have any familiarity with the Bronx, if you've heard of the Hutchinson River or the Hutchinson River Parkway, those, that river and that road are named for her. So, she stepped outside of the established gender norms of the time, um, and, she was punished and, you know, killed later on, um, in her life. Almost 40 years later, she lost her life in war. The last of these dissenters that we'll talk about is a woman named Mary Dyer. Now, Mary Dyer was a Quaker, so it's important to sort of place her in context. She's a Quaker. Um, if you remember, we talked about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania isn't established until 1681. The first Quaker migrations to Pennsylvania happened that year. But there had been Quakers in England for decades before they were finally more or less expelled and forced to leave the country. Mary Dyer was Quaker in England, she and her husband, and she traveled to North America. She lived in the Dutch settlement in New Netherland for a while. She lived in some of the other English colonies, but she kept going to Massachusetts to preach. And remember, I told you when we talked about the Quakers that Quakers were allowed to, Quakers believed that women and men could preach, could be ministers, could hear the word of God, could interpret it. They believed in equality in that way. And so Mary Dyer travels to Massachusetts to spread her views. And you probably already know this is not going to end well because the Puritans don't want to hear other people's religious views. And they especially hated Quakers. These very peaceful, tolerant, kind people. The Puritans couldn't stand the Quakers. They didn't have ministers. They didn't really have churches or structured religious services. They allowed men, women, and children to stand up and speak and interpret the Bible. The Quakers and the Puritans were worlds apart in terms of their understanding of Christianity, and especially that Mary Dyer is a woman and she's standing, on street corners in Boston preaching, is very offensive to the Puritans, who are trying to keep a lid on any kind of disagreement or dissent. So she is, she travels to Massachusetts, she's arrested and she's kicked out. She goes back, she's arrested again, she's kicked out again, and she's warned. She's like, if you come back again, we'll execute you next time. We've let you get out with your life a few times already, but if you keep coming back here and breaking our rules, next time will be the last time. And in 1660, Mary Dyer went back to Massachusetts anyway. She tried preaching. She was arrested. She was convicted in a Puritan court. And you can see in this image here, she was taken and hanged in the Boston Common, which is today the large park in Boston. And so the Puritans, again, these were people who fled a repressive society, came to North America, and created their own repressive society. Now, if you remember, we talked about the troubles that the Pilgrims had in establishing a relationship with the Wampanoag, their indigenous neighbors. And there are some important differences with the Puritans that we're going to talk about, but there are some similarities which are also worth pointing out. The power struggle that I talked about between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, excuse me, regarding who should be in charge of the colony, who should set the rules, who should follow whose rules. That same power struggle plays out between the Puritans and their indigenous neighbors. So the Puritans' ideas about quote unquote civilization, their sense of superiority, their feeling that indigenous people are inferior to them, their ideas about right of discovery, all of that is the same, right? So there's really no need for me to uh, explain those same points again. Indigenous people, for their part, of course, welcomed their new Puritan neighbors. They wanted to share resources with them and be welcoming, just as they were usually with all people. But at the same time, indigenous people knew that they had been there longer and that if anybody was going to set rules and regulations, it should be them, and that the newcomers should follow their rules. So there's going to be a struggle over power between these groups. Much like the Pilgrims, the Puritans also establish a trade relationship with indigenous people. They bring consumer goods with them on their ships because they know they're going to need to do some kind of business with indigenous people to learn how to survive and support themselves. And so there is a trade relationship between these two groups that is very similar to the one established by between the Puritans and the Wampanoag. So the first sort of half of the outline here, up to Christian conversions. In your notes, you could more or less just take what you wrote down about the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag and transfer those same ideas over here, because it's basically the same. I mean, there isn't a lot of difference. The difference comes when we start talking about Christian conversions. So this is an important point. The Puritans, just like basically every other European group that traveled and established settlements overseas, the Puritans believed that part of their responsibility was to spread Christianity and gather converts to the faith, right? They strongly believed in that. And because the Puritans have come for religious purposes, they haven't come over here to make money or to find gold or silver or to move up in social class. They've come over here for religious reasons. The Puritans take this issue of conversion and spreading Christianity, they take it probably more seriously than any other European group that comes over. And one of the ways that they tried to do this was by establishing communities called praying towns. And I have a slide, the next slide I'll show you a map of these to further illustrate my point. The Puritans built towns specifically designed for indigenous people who were going to convert to Christianity. So indigenous people who were going to convert to Christianity would have to move to this town. They would have to live just like I just showed you a few minutes ago in that map of Sudbury, Massachusetts. They would have to live in a town with houses built very close to one another. They would have to learn how to farm, grow their crops and tend their animals, and then return to their house at night. They would go to church every week, just like Puritans did. They would also learn English, but a number of other transformations would take place in the praying town. The indigenous people, in addition to living in single-family homes, which is very unusual for indigenous people, to working on their farmland, to attending church and learning English, they would also change their names. They would also change the way that they dressed. the way that they cut their hair, um, the way that they raised their children, the jobs that men and women did would change, right? Men would be doing the farming, hunting, and fishing. Women would be staying home, cleaning, cooking, taking care of the children. So not only was the praying town designed to convert indigenous people to Christianity, it was also designed to quote unquote civilize indigenous people, right? Now, why would the Puritans want to quote unquote civilize indigenous people? Well, first, they do see it as their responsibility. They see it as their Christian duty to do this, which we've talked about, so that's part of it. But also, they don't want to have conflict with indigenous people, but they are also not comfortable with diversity, right? We've talked about this before in this class and also in this lesson. So they want their neighbors to be as close to looking like them, sounding like them, and thinking like them as possible. So if indigenous people could be turned into English Christians, you know, their skin color might still be different, they might speak English with an accent, but everything else about them will seem English. If they can do that, then the belief would be that indigenous people and English Puritans could coexist in peace, right? So there's never any sense that Europeans should convert to indigenous ways, right? Because again, Europeans assume they're superior, and indigenous peoples never try to convert Europeans to their way of living. So you see sort of the difference between these two groups in the way that they're looking at each other. Now you might ask yourself, why would an indigenous person move to a praying town? Well, let's look back to something we talked about before. Remember indigenous people in French Canada converting to Christianity, right? Those deathbed conversions we talked about, where an indigenous person might be sick with smallpox and might have a Catholic priest or nun sitting near the bedside, praying with them and holding their hand, and they might survive. At that point, they might decide, oh, you know, this person must have special powers, this religion must be extra special, I should join if I want to save my life. Alternatively, an indigenous person might have witnessed their entire family or community die of disease brought by the Europeans. And they might realize, you know what, I'm the only one left. These people are here to stay. They're not really threatening me. As long as I'm going to be here, I might as well try to adapt to this new environment that I'm living in. So I'll move to the praying town and, you know, convert and quote unquote civilize. So for a variety of reasons, indigenous people might decide that they would move to a praying town and convert to Christianity. Now, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, from the 1620s, 1630s, really through, I'd say, the 1650s, 60s, 70s, for a few decades, indigenous people and Puritans, and Pilgrims for that matter, lived together more or less in peace in Plymouth and in Massachusetts Bay. There was always tension, obviously, but there was no major outbreak of war. English people had large families, needed lots of land, but indigenous people generally were able to stay on their ancestral lands. English people living near them, And there was sort of an uneasy coexistence among the two groups for quite a while. But by the middle of the 17th century, the middle of the 1600s, as English families are getting larger, right, that first generation has had children, and now those children are starting to have their own children. The demands for land are going up. English people need lots of land, and English people start encroaching on indigenous land, effectively meaning invading indigenous land. And that is going to cause a major problem in the future, which we're going to come back to. I mentioned earlier that I would show you a map of the praying towns in New England. You can see that they were mainly concentrated in Massachusetts Bay Colony. There were a couple in Connecticut. The first one, if you're interested, the very first praying town was Natick, Massachusetts. It's a town southwest of Boston. You can see it there on the map. And you see there that in Plymouth, there were no praying towns. So the idea of the praying town and the praying Indian was a uniquely Puritan idea of gathering large numbers of indigenous people in a community, separating them from their original home, and then using that town as a tool to control their thoughts, to control their opinions, control their minds, and change them into English Puritans, right? That's a uniquely Puritan project. Now, even though indigenous people and the Puritans made an effort to live together in peace, to coexist with each other, even though many indigenous people attempted to find a way to peacefully live with the Puritans by becoming Christians and becoming quote unquote civilized English people, many indigenous people did not move into praying towns. Many had no interest in becoming Christian or changing their way of life. I'd say the vast majority of indigenous people wanted to continue living as they had always lived. And of course, I mentioned at the end of the last discussion of this in this lesson that by the mid 17th century, indigenous peoples are finding it very difficult to stay on their lands as the Puritan population is going up and Puritans are demanding more and more land for building towns and building farms. So, just to review, indigenous people did not believe you could own land, which also means you couldn't buy land or sell it. These were not acceptable activities. You could live on a piece of land, right? So one relationship that was allowed, you could live on land. Obviously, you couldn't live suspended in midair or in water, so living on the land was fine. You could use the resources on the land, right? The water, the soil, the plants, the wildlife. You just couldn't own the land or its resources. You could use them. You could live there. You could claim land, right? You could claim land as a home based on two rationales. And again, this is review. You could claim land based on the fact that your group had been there for hundreds or thousands of years, so based on historical inhabitation. And you could claim land based on winning that land in a war. But there was no sense that land could be owned, bought, or sold. You could live there, you could use the resources, you could claim it as a home based on history or military victory. But that was it. And of course, indigenous people believed that you had an obligation to share resources and welcome people to your land. The English population, and I'm going to show you a map in a minute that illustrates this, the English population of New England was growing rapidly by the middle of the 17th century. The Puritans used an inheritance system called partible descent, and I want to let you know that I like asking questions about partible descent. So it's particularly important that you have good notes about, partible descent. As I said, partible descent is an inheritance system. So when a male authority figure in a family, the husband slash father, when he died, when a Puritan husband father died, this was the system that would be used to determine who in the family got what of his possessions, right? So under partible descent, when the husband slash father died, his surviving widow would get 1/3 of the land. So the widow would get 1/3 of the land, because if she's still living, she needs a place to stay. And the children would get the rest of the property divided evenly among them. So if there were 10 children, the 10 children would each get an equal sized piece of land for themselves. And that when they got older, they would, get married, and they would have that piece of land that their father left for them, and they would live there and have their own farm and have their own children. But hopefully you can see the problem with this. The original father slash husband figure, he had a large piece of land. He died. The land got divided up into 11 pieces, 1/3 for the widow, the remaining land divided among the 10 children. Each of those 10 children is going to get a small piece of land. They're going to get married. They're going to have a large family too. They're going to leave land to their children. But the problem is, how are you going to support a family of 12 or more on a small piece of land, right? How are you going to have enough land to grow enough food? How will you have enough pasture for your livestock? You won't be able to do it. So as long as the Puritans were using partible descent, that meant that they were going to constantly need new pieces of land, because you can't provide for 12 people on a tiny piece of land. You need a large farm to do that. So partible descent meant that as the generations passed and the population increased, Puritans were going to have to move away into new areas of the Northeast looking for land. And inevitably, they were going to run into indigenous people. Remember too, and this is review, Europeans believed that land could be owned. They believed you could buy it, you could sell it. It was just like buying or selling any other good. And as I just mentioned, they believe, or they have this great need for land because they're all farmers, they have large families, and they have this inheritance system which over time leaves the younger generations with less land than they actually need. So as I said, the solution to this problem for the Puritans is to simply move to new areas of the Northeast looking for land, where they can build their farms and build their homes and their towns. But as I said, inevitably they are going to run into indigenous people. And then they have to figure out how to get control of that indigenous land. Because again, Europeans believe you can own land and they want that land for themselves. They're not interested in sharing their land. So when Puritans began moving into new areas of the Northeast, outside Boston and outside the initial settlements, they found that much of what is now Massachusetts, New Hampshire, the eastern coast of Maine, Connecticut, they found that most of those places were wilderness, right? That they were covered in forest. There were indigenous people. There was a lot of wildlife. There were no roads. There were no communities. There were large stretches of land where there was no evidence of human life. What we would think of as wilderness, right? Uninhabited, unbuilt forest. And so for English people, when they saw the wilderness, they basically saw empty real estate. They saw land that no one was using. There were no people, there were no buildings, no roads, no trails, no paths. And so, again, with that idea of right of discovery in mind, Europeans, Puritans in this case, would find a piece of property. It might be a thick, dense forest. And they'd look around and they'd say, okay, well, there's no one here. There's no sign of life. And they might start cutting down the forest. That same day, they might start burning brush. They might begin flattening the terrain, planting crops, letting their animals graze. They might start putting up a house. And they'd take over, right? It's theirs. They didn't even really have to purchase it. They didn't have to sign a contract. Now, of course, what's the problem with this activity? The problem is just because a piece of land didn't have people in it and didn't have buildings or roads doesn't mean that it wasn't being used, right? You guys remember, indigenous people, many of them moved around at different times of the year, different seasons, to take advantage of different resources available in their environment. So the Puritans might have gone into a forest that wasn't being used at that time, but that would be used later on. And what often happened was indigenous people would come back eventually for their seasonal hunting or fishing activities and find that Puritans had moved in. And by that point, though, there was very little that the indigenous people could do, right? So that was one way that the Puritans seized indigenous land, but again, without really even realizing that they were doing that. Because to the Puritans, the land was empty. In cases where indigenous people were living on land that the Puritans wanted, right? So these are different cases. These are lands that have been cleared. If the Puritans could get control of those lands, they wouldn't have to cut down the trees or burn brush or anything like that. In cases where there were lands that indigenous people lived on that English people wanted, there were other ways of English people taking those lands. The first was by trying to purchase the land from indigenous people. You see this contract here on the slide from Rehoboth, Massachusetts from 1662. Now, if you remember our discussion of New Netherland and Peter Minuit's so-called purchase of Manhattan in 1626, this is somewhat similar. English people, Puritans, not really understanding that indigenous people did not believe you could buy or sell or own land would simply draw up contracts and take the contracts to the indigenous people and attempt to purchase their land, right? They might try to give them cash, they might try to give them some cheap costume jewelry or some kitchen tools or some farm tools in exchange for their land. Sometimes they would get the indigenous people to actually place a mark on the contract. And I mentioned that to you when we talked about New Netherland. And you can see on this contract here, you can see the English have written out the names of the indigenous people they were meeting with, and you can see his mark next to each name and a character written on the page by the indigenous person, because as I mentioned, indigenous people did not have written languages. So in order to sign a contract, they would sort of just be told to make a mark with a pen on the page. So, they might be tricked into placing a mark on this piece of paper. Of course, the indigenous people can't read the contract. They don't really know what they're agreeing to. But by the time they sign the contract, for the English, it's over. The contract is signed. That means the land now belongs to them. And sometimes they would forcibly evict indigenous people from their land after the contract was signed. And of course, indigenous people would not really understand what was going on. Again, there was lack of clear communication and also different understandings of land ownership, right? Now, in cases where indigenous people would not sign these contracts, and eventually indigenous people began to learn not to sign these things because they would lead to bad consequences, Puritans would bring free alcohol for the indigenous people. They knew that indigenous people liked alcohol, and they would provide them free alcohol. They'd have the contract there. They might have a few drinks, get them drunk, pass the contract around while they're drunk and they're not thinking clearly, have them mark the contract, and then, while the indigenous people were sort of recovering from their heavy drinking, their hangover, the English would be busy moving on to their land. So that was another way that they could seize indigenous land without going to war. Another way of doing this, which I talked about in our lesson about New Netherland, which was very common in New England, involved using the court system to seize indigenous land. And I talked about this before, so hopefully you remember this issue involving European livestock, pigs, goats, cows, damaging indigenous farmland, indigenous farmers killing the English livestock and sometimes eating them, and then the English farmer suing the indigenous person for damages for destroying their property, even though there had been property damage on both sides, right? The indigenous farmers' crops often trampled by European animals, and the European animals usually killed and butchered by the indigenous person, who believed that that was a just action, considering that same animal had destroyed their crops. And we talked about how, at least in New Netherland, and the same was true in New England, that the courts almost always sided with the European, right? The Dutch in New Netherland, the English in New England. And the punishment to the indigenous person almost always involved losing their land and transferring it to the English. The English, though, were so desperate for land in New England that they had one other way of getting land away from indigenous people, and this involved passing laws against public drunkenness. So making it a crime to be drunk in public. So that was the sort of the first step. So you couldn't be drunk in public. Okay. Well, what's the big deal? Well, if an indigenous person was drunk in public, they could be prosecuted, right? So the question then became how to get indigenous people drunk in public. So how did the Puritans do this? Whenever the Puritans celebrated a holiday or a funeral, right? Because Puritans typically got drunk at funerals. Even small children did. And if you were taking a class on colonial America, we could talk about this in more detail. Weddings, Puritans didn't drink at weddings, they drank at funerals. So whenever there was a funeral, whenever there was a public holiday that was being celebrated, the Puritans would bring out their alcohol. And they would often invite indigenous people to attend. And the alcohol would be free. And the events would be held in public. So indigenous people come to the party or the event or the funeral. They have some drinks, they get drunk, they're in public, they're under arrest, right? The punishments for public drunkenness were extremely severe for indigenous people. The first option involved a heavy fine that no indigenous person could afford to pay. So the first punishment would be this very heavy fine that, as far as I can tell from my reading on this topic, and I read quite extensively in this topic in graduate school and even since I've been out of school, no indigenous person that I know of had the money to pay these fines. So knowing that the indigenous people couldn't pay these fines, the Puritans had two options for the indigenous person for their punishment. The first option, if they couldn't pay the fine, was to be whipped on their bare back with a hard piece of leather in public for 7 consecutive days. So they would be publicly punished with a whipping on their bare back for 7 consecutive days. And that is a punishment that could kill a person after one day, right, of being hit 10 times severely and very hardly hit with a hard piece of leather on your back. If you didn't want to be killed, because that would kill most people pretty quickly, your second option would be to be sold into slavery, right? So the Puritans, again, you think about these people deeply religious. They want to build a model society. They see themselves as model Christians. They want to reform the church. But then you look at how they treat indigenous people. So you can't pay the fine, so here we'll give you 2 terrible options. One, be slowly killed through a public whipping, or be sold into slavery. In either case, the indigenous person is going to disappear from the colony, which makes their land eligible for seizure, right, in the end. In the event that all of those solutions, quote unquote, didn't work, then the Puritans might fight a war with indigenous people for their land. Now, I mentioned before that I would show you a map to illustrate the growth of Puritan and Pilgrim settlement in New England. This is by 1674, and you can see Boston up there near Massachusetts Bay, 1630. You see Plymouth, 1620. And you see all the green. So you see that within, half a century or so, the Puritan and Pilgrim population had greatly expanded from its original location or locations. Uh, a lot of this had to do with the large families that they had, and also the need for large farms and large pieces of land to pass along to the next generation, which was a very important concern for people living in that society. So I just mentioned that if all else failed, the English would resort to warfare against indigenous people to get control of their land. And we're going to look at two cases of this right now. The first in Connecticut in the 1630s, a conflict called the Pequot War. So we'll look at the background of this conflict for a moment. So if you remember from our lesson about New Netherland, the Dutch West India Company had claimed control of Connecticut as part of its holdings in North America. Connecticut was part of New Netherland. The Dutch had built a fort on the Connecticut River that later became Hartford, Connecticut. And it was it was actually Dutch fur traders who carried smallpox into Connecticut in 1633 and 1634, which infected large numbers of indigenous people and reduced the indigenous population of the area. The introduction of smallpox by the Dutch was followed 2 years later by the arrival of Thomas Hooker and his followers after they were expelled from Massachusetts. So the Dutch entry into Connecticut was quickly followed by the arrival of this first group of English Puritans in 1636. Excuse me. The same year that the English arrived in Connecticut, there was a murder that took place in the colony. A handful of English traders, I think 4 or 5 individuals involved mainly in the fur trade, were found dead. And immediately the English Puritans believed that local Pequot, who are Algonquin inhabitants of Connecticut, believed that some local Pequot were actually the murderers, that they were responsible for killing these English traders. The Pequot rejected this idea, said that they were not responsible for killing these English traders. The English countered by saying that the Pequot were responsible, and the tensions between the two sides eventually exploded into warfare. Now again, the issue here is who was responsible for killing these English traders, but both sides see an opportunity here. The English see an opportunity, if they can defeat the Pequot in war, to take their land. The Pequot, for their part, if they can defeat the English, they might be able to drive them out of Connecticut. Now, the English realized that in order to defeat the Pequot, they would probably need allies. And the two groups that the English found as allies were the Narragansett and the Mohegan, who also lived in southern Connecticut and in Rhode Island. And what's important about these two groups is that they were historical enemies of the Pequot. So the English insert themselves into pre-existing conflicts, much like the Dutch had done at Fort Orange. They take sides in a pre-existing conflict, a conflict that predated their arrival. They side with the Narragansett and Mohegan against the Pequot. And at that point, the sides are established in this conflict, and each side has the same objective, which is to destroy the other. The English want the Pequot land, the Pequot want the English out of Connecticut, and if they can also defeat their historical enemies, the Narragansett and Mohegan, so much the better. As it turned out, the English had a superior number of soldiers, and they also had superior weapons. And those two factors helped them defeat the Pequot by 1637. When the Pequot were finally defeated, the English response, these are Puritans, Puritan response was pretty severe. The Pequot leaders who survived, some of them were put to death in a very violent way, publicly executed. Some Pequot children were actually adopted by English Puritans and kept in their homes as servants, sometimes for the rest of their natural lives. Some were sold into slavery. The Puritans became active slave traders. In fact, it wasn't long after the Pequot War that the Massachusetts General Court, which was the legislature, the lawmaking body in Massachusetts, legalized slavery in 1641. Race-based slavery, right? So at first we have indigenous people being sold into slavery, Pequots being sold into slavery in the Caribbean and in other parts of colonial America. But what's important here is that Massachusetts is the first colony in North America to legalize slavery, right? There was slavery in Virginia, but until really the 1660s, it wasn't legal or illegal, right? It was just happening. Massachusetts, a northern colony, is the first colony to legalize slavery, which of course happens after the English have already sold large numbers of Pequot into slavery. And as I said, there are Pequot enslaved people who end up in Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas. Some end up in the Caribbean. And of course, the goal here for the English was seizing control of Pequot land. That was the issue. Of course, the conflict starts over this disagreement about who murdered these traitors, but there was always this bigger objective, which was that if the English could defeat the Pequot militarily, they could take their land, and of course, they were able to achieve that objective. This map I include just to show you where this conflict took place. As you can see, mainly in Connecticut, a little bit of diversion into Rhode Island, and you can see on Block Island, which is in the Atlantic, just off the southern coast of Rhode Island, that's where the war actually started in 1636. Now, the second and final conflict that we'll look at, probably the more famous and more significant of these two major wars between the Puritans and indigenous people, a conflict called King Philip's War. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and this is an important point, and that's why I continue to underline these points for you to reinforce them. The English population in Massachusetts is growing as the years go by. New generations are born. The average family size, 10 children. The system of partible descent, where each child, regardless of sex, receives an equal-sized piece of land, and those customs and traditions are continued generation by generation, made it almost inevitable that English Puritans would end up living on indigenous land, and that was the problem that we talked about earlier. By the 1650s and into the 1660s and early 1670s, Puritans, and to a certain extent Pilgrims as well, were moving onto Wampanoag land. And this again was land that had more or less for a long time been basically left alone by the English. The Wampanoag and the English had an understanding that they would sort of try to coexist and live as neighbors and respect each other's boundaries. But the English demand for land was so great that eventually English people are building homes on indigenous land. And the Wampanoag in particular are becoming really angry and upset with the English for what they viewed as breaking a deal that they had made. The head of the Wampanoag was a man named Metacom, who the English called King Philip. The English would not call him by his name, and since he was the head of the Wampanoag Nation, they used the term king, which is of course a term they would be familiar with, and gave him an English name. Now, Metacom, King Philip, lived in eastern Massachusetts, lived on his ancestral land, had developed a relationship with the Puritan authorities, generally got along with them, tried to maintain peace between the two groups, tried to keep the two groups apart from each other. The English had tried many times to get Metacom to convert to Christianity. He refused. They wanted him to quote-unquote civilize. He refused that. He could communicate in English with the Puritans. Eventually, he did pick up the language and was able to communicate with them, but he resisted all efforts to become Christian and to quote-unquote civilize, which greatly upset the English, that he resisted those efforts. Now, King Philip Metacom, by the 1670s, is very nervous and very unhappy that the English are, year after year, moving on to his nation's land, especially after the English had effectively agreed to respect boundaries. And by 1675, Metacom and his close associates are starting to plan a response to English invasions of their territory. One of King Philip's close associates was a man named John Sassamon. John Sassamon was a Wampanoag, just like Metacom. John Sassamon, though, was a praying Indian. John Sassamon had converted to Christianity. As you can see, he had taken an English first and last name. He spoke English. He could read and write. He attended church services. But he had returned to the Wampanoag Nation and was a close associate of King Philip. So he sort of operated in both worlds. What King Philip did not realize was that John Sassamon was a spy for the English, right? So that the English had introduced Christianity to John Sassamon in a praying town. They had also, quote unquote, civilized him. You can see his name, which is a European style name. But they had also enlisted him as a spy. So everything that Metacom was planning, John Sassamon was telling the English about. When Metacom discovered that John Sassamon was a spy, Metacom ordered John Sassamon killed, right? Because he was a dangerous person. He was spying for the English. In the winter of 1675, Metacom ordered 3 of his associates to kill John Sassamon. And what they did, they met him out on a frozen pond and hit him over the head and then shoved his body under the ice and then left him there. And his body wasn't discovered until the ice melted in the spring. The English, interestingly, reacted to this, right? So this was a case, the killing of John Sassamon was Wampanoag people killing a Wampanoag person on Wampanoag land, which you would think the English would stay out of this. But John Sassamon was an important asset to the English because he was a spy for them. And when he was found dead, it was the English who did an investigation and arrested 3 Wampanoag men for killing John Sassamon, put them on trial in an English court, convicted them of murder, and hanged them in early 1675. And it was the execution of these 3 men by the English for killing John Sassamon that sparked King Philip's War. The execution of those 3 men by the English, right? The Wampanoag believed that the killing of John Sassamon, first of all, they believed was justified because he was a spy, but that second, if Wampanoag crimes were to be prosecuted, that they should be prosecuted in Wampanoag courts, not in English courts. And so this sort of overstep by the English in arresting, prosecuting, convicting, and executing Wampanoags who had killed a Wampanoag, that was a bridge too far for the English. So the Wampanoag have allies, right? They have the Narragansett and the Nipmuc. The English, of course, have their praying Indians. The Pequot, who have now switched sides in this conflict. The Mohegan, who actually fought against the Pequot in the Pequot War. These 2 groups are now on the same side. The Massachusetts, which is an indigenous group, and the Mohawk from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in upstate New York actually joined sides with the English as well. They already had a relationship in New York, and they help out the Puritans in New England. The objectives on each side, both sides are trying to basically destroy the other. I don't want to oversimplify this, but there is sort of a sense that this is sort of the last straw for both sides. The English, of course, want as much land as possible, and this war will be an opportunity to drive away as many indigenous people as possible. The Wampanoag, I think, really want the English out completely. They're fed up. praying Indians play an important role here. This is nearly half a century after the Puritans arrived, so there's actually a sizable population of indigenous people who are Christian, who speak English, who read and write English, who have taken English names, who dress with English clothes. They've adopted English gender norms. They've sort of been absorbed into these Puritan communities. Some of them are soldiers for the English, as I pointed out. Many of them serve as translators because they do speak multiple languages in addition to English. But during King Philip's War, the English, who had spent so much time and energy trying to bring Christianity to indigenous people, suddenly look at praying Indians with suspicion, right? And you can probably imagine why. The praying Indians are being asked to take up arms and potentially shoot and kill their own extended family, former neighbors, former friends, right? There is a fear among the English that asking praying Indians to kill other Indians who they might be related to or might know or might be friends with might cause the praying Indians to change their minds, right? And to go from being English to being indigenous again. And the fear of this happening, the fear that quote unquote civilized indigenous people would revert back to being just plain old indigenous people, that fear drove the English to arrest all of their praying Indians. The ones that they had enlisted as soldiers and translators, and a large number of others, and put them on boats in the fall of 1675 and sent them to an island in Boston Harbor called Deer Island, where they were left with no food, no clean water, no medical treatment, no medicine, and many of them starved to death on that island during that first winter. So you could see sort of the cold-hearted calculations that Puritans made when those calculations would serve their interests, right? So in many cases, their Christianity had limits, as you've seen. They came to America for religious reasons, but their religious purpose did have limits. And you could see that they sort of passed those limits many times. The English, of course, as you can probably imagine, and their allies had superior weapons and supplies and equipment, and a large number of supportive indigenous people who helped the English win King Philip's War by 1677. But the costs of this war were significant. 2,500 English and their allies were killed. That represented, or I should say 10% of the white population of New England was killed in this conflict. And dozens of towns and hundreds of farms were destroyed, right, burned to the ground. The Wampanoag and their allies lost at least 5,000 people killed. 40% of the indigenous population, which was already low, was killed in King Philip's War, an enormous loss. And they also lost dozens of villages and many farms that were destroyed. The English punished Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Nipmuc leaders with public executions, just like I mentioned earlier in the Pequot War, and many indigenous peoples who survived survived King Philip's War were sold into slavery, which by this point was fully legal in Massachusetts. And of course, what was one of the main objectives for the English, just like in the Pequot War? Seizing control of more indigenous land. And military victory was always viewed as an acceptable way of doing that, right? Which allowed for the Puritans to expand into areas that would allow them to continue having large families, to continue using partible descent as their inheritance system, and to continue this experiment and this project of reforming the Church of England with the hope of returning home someday in the future. This is an image of Metacom, King Philip, the Wampanoag leader, and you can see that, and this was an image actually created by Paul Revere. You may have heard of Paul Revere, the famous Boston silversmith and political propagandist from the era of the American Revolution. He drew this picture. So this picture, almost a century after King Philip's War was fought, but I think shows you that for all the information I provided to you earlier about King Philip, about him not accepting Christianity, not wanting to be quote-unquote civilized, he obviously did take some elements of European culture and incorporated those into his life. He has an English rifle, you can see holding there with his left hand. He's wearing a pair of what appear to be English-style shoes. There's clearly a European hatchet laying on the ground between his feet, and a powder horn, which of course would have been used to make his rifle operate properly. So, an indigenous leader to be sure, but someone who was not immune to the sort of cultural changes going on around him. This is a map of King Philip's War, just to show you how large and sort of complex this conflict was. Spread over a vast territory over a very long period of time, at least for the 1670s, and a very destructive conflict as well. And you can just take a look at this, at your convenience, just to see sort of where the action took place. And this final image I share with you is actually from the post office in Natick, Massachusetts. If you're ever in Natick and you want to see the original of this, this is from the 1930s, this mural of John Eliot. John Eliot speaks to the Natick Indians, October 1675. This is a rendering of that moment when the praying Indians that we've talked about, who were under suspicion by the English during King Philip's War, were arrested, and you can see here they've got chains around their necks, arrested and forcibly removed to Deer Island in Boston Harbor, where many of them died. Thank you for listening as always. Good luck with your studying. If you have any questions or concerns, please email me, and I will talk to you next time.